The stench of stale whiskey and unwashed bodies hung heavy in the air of the gem saloon, but the silence that fell over the room was louder than any gunshot. In the center of the smoke-choked gambling hall, a trembling woman stood tethered to a chair like livestock, her eyes fixed on the sawdust floor. She was the pot, the final bet, a human life wagered against a pair of kings. But what the men at that table didn't know, what the winner of that hand couldn't possibly suspect, was that the shivering, silent girl wasn't a victim. She was a weapon waiting to be drawn, and the secret she carried in the bodice of her torn dress would bring the entire territory to its knees. Deadwood, Dakota Territory, October 1876. Rain lashed against the muddy thoroughfare of Deadwood Gulch, turning the street into a slurry of filth and fool's gold. Inside the Gem Variety Theater and Saloon, the air was warm, thick with the smell of tobacco and desperation. Jeremiah Holt didn't belong there. Standing 6'4" with shoulders that strained the seams of his buffalo hide coat, he looked like a piece of the mountain that had broken off and rolled into town. He was a trapper, a man of the high bighorns, who came down to civilization only when the winter supplies ran dangerously low. His face was a map of harsh winters, hidden beneath a thick, dark beard, but his eyes were sharp, piercing blue and devoid of fear. He sat at a corner table, nursing a lukewarm beer, watching the game unfold in the center of the room. The man dealing the cards was Cornelius Ace Rourke. Rourke was everything Jeremiah despised, a dandy in a velvet suit with oil in his hair and cruelty in his smile. He was losing, and he was losing bad. "I'm out of cash, gentlemen," Rourke hissed, sweat beading on his upper lip. He looked at the pile of chips across from him, sitting in front of a quiet miner named Swede. "But I have assets." Rourke snapped his fingers. A heavy-set brute emerged from the back room, dragging a woman by the arm. The saloon went quiet. She was small, frail-looking, dressed in a gray calico dress that had seen better years. Her hair, the color of spun honey, was matted and hidden beneath a grime-stained shawl. She didn't fight. She didn't cry. She just stood there, staring at the floor with a vacant, hollow expression. "This here is Verity," Rourke announced, his voice booming with false joviality. "My ward. A bit simple in the head, can't speak a word, mute as a post, but she cooks, cleans, and warms a bed well enough." A murmur of disgust rippled through the room, but curiosity dampened it. "I value her at $500, Rourke said, tossing a ring of keys onto the table. "Winner takes the girl and the deed to her indenture." Jeremiah's hand tightened around his glass until the glass groaned. He had seen men trade horses and dogs, but never a woman. Not like this. He watched the girl. She didn't flinch. It was as if she wasn't there at all. The Swede shook his head. "I ain't playing for flesh, Rourke. Put up gold or fold." Rourke's eyes darted around the room, desperate. "Any man here willing to buy into the pot? 500? Jeremiah stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floorboards. He walked to the table, his boots thudding with heavy finality. He reached into his coat and slammed a heavy leather pouch onto the table. It clinked with the unmistakable sound of raw gold nuggets. "I'm in," Jeremiah said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the chests of the men nearby. Rourke grinned, a predatory flash of teeth. "Deal him in." The cards were dealt. 5-card draw. Jeremiah didn't look at his cards. He looked at the girl. For a split second, Verity looked up. Her eyes met his. They weren't the eyes of a simpleton. They were green, sharp, and burning with a terrified intelligence that vanished as quickly as it appeared. She looked back down immediately. "She's playing a game too," Jeremiah thought. "Cards?" Rourke asked. "I'll play these," Jeremiah said, not drawing. Rourke smaltered. He discarded 2, drew 2. He chuckled nervously. "Full house. Kings over 10s. He spread his cards. "Read 'em and weep. Mountain man." Jeremiah didn't blink. He slowly overturned his cards, one by one. The ace of spades. The king of spades. The queen. The jack. The 10. A royal flush. The room erupted. Rourke's face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray. He lunged for the keys on the table, but Jeremiah's hand, massive and scarred, slammed down over them first. "The girl," Jeremiah said, his voice deadly calm. "She's mine." Rourke stood up, his hand hovering near the derringer tucked in his vest. "You cheated. No man gets a natural royal flush. Are you calling me a liar?" Jeremiah asked. He shifted his stance, his coat falling open just enough to reveal the bone handle of a heavy Bowie knife and the butt of a Colt peacemaker. Al Swearingen, the owner of the gem, stepped out from the shadows, sensing blood. He won fair. "Rourke, get out before I have Dan throw you out." Rourke glared at Jeremiah, then at the girl. He leaned in close to Verity, whispering something in her ear that made her flinch for the first time. Then he stormed out into the rain. Jeremiah scooped up the gold and the keys. He walked over to the girl. She wouldn't look at him. She was trembling so hard her teeth chattered. "Let's go," he muttered. He took her arm, gently, unlike the brute before, and led her out of the saloon. As they stepped into the pouring rain, the eyes of every man in the room bored into their backs. Jeremiah Holt had won the pot, but as he looked at the shivering woman beside him, he had a sinking feeling that the game had only just begun. The Black Hills. 2 days later. The journey up the mountain was brutal. The rain had turned to sleet, and the wind howled through the canyons like a dying wolf. Jeremiah rode his massive roan stallion, Buster, while Verity rode a skittish mare he had purchased at the livery stable before leaving town. For 2 days, she hadn't made a sound. Not a whimper, not a cough, not a word. She was an enigma that frustrated him. He was a man who valued silence. He had lived alone in a cabin at 8,000 feet for 5 years, but her silence felt heavy. It felt deliberate. He had tried to talk to her the first night. He told her he wasn't going to hurt her. He told her he intended to take her to the mission in Spearfish, where the nuns would take her in. But the snow had closed the pass to Spearfish. They were forced to head higher, toward his cabin. "You cold?" Jeremiah called back over the howling wind. Verity nodded once, pulling the buffalo robe he'd given her tighter around her slight frame. Jeremiah halted his horse and dismounted. He walked back to her. "We stop here. The horses need a rest, and the storm is getting worse." He lifted her off the horse. She was light, too light. Under the heavy robes, he could feel her ribs. Rourke had starved her. A surge of anger, hot and unfamiliar, twisted in his gut. They took shelter in a shallow cave protected by a rocky overhang. Jeremiah built a fire with practiced efficiency, the flames soon licking at the dry pine branches. He boiled coffee and roasted some salt pork. He handed her a tin cup. "Drink. It'll warm you." Verity took the cup with both hands, her fingers numb and blue. She stared into the fire, her face illuminated by the dancing orange light. Without the grime of the saloon, Jeremiah could see she was younger than he thought, perhaps 22 or 23. Her features were delicate, high cheekbones and a jawline that suggested a stubborn streak. "I know you ain't simple," Jeremiah said suddenly, poking the fire with a stick. Verity froze. The cup stopped halfway to her mouth. "I saw your eyes back in the gem," he continued, not looking at her. "And I see how you tie your boots. A simpleton don't tie double knots with that kind of precision. And you ride well. You anticipate the horse's movement." He turned his head, locking eyes with her. "You can talk, can't you?" Verity stared at him. For a moment, he thought she might speak. Her lips parted slightly, a tremor passing through them. But then, the mask slammed back down. Her eyes went vacant, and she shook her head slowly, pointing to her throat and making a guttural, choking sound. Jeremiah sighed, rubbing his face with his calloused hand. "Fine. Play it your way, girl. But up here, secrets get you killed faster than the cold." He rolled out his bedroll and tossed her a separate blanket on the other side of the fire. "Sleep. We have a hard ride tomorrow." Jeremiah feigned sleep quickly, his breathing deepening into a rhythm. But his hand rested on his Colt beneath the blanket, and his eyes remained a slit open. Around midnight, the fire had burned down to embers. Verity sat up. She moved with a silence that was unnatural for a city girl. She didn't move toward the horses to escape. She didn't move toward him to kill him. She reached into the bodice of her dress and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook and a charcoal pencil. She opened it to a page filled with dense, frantic handwriting. She wrote for several minutes. the scratching of the charcoal barely audible over the wind. Then she stopped. She looked at Jeremiah, studying his sleeping form. A look of profound sadness and conflict crossed her face. She touched her throat, a genuine tear slipping down her cheek. She tucked the book away and lay back down. Jeremiah closed his eyes fully, his heart hammering against his ribs. She was educated. She could write. And she was documenting something. The next morning, the sun broke through the gray clouds, illuminating the white peaks of the bighorns. They packed up in silence. As Jeremiah tightened the cinch on her saddle, he noticed something he had missed before. Her sleeve had ridden up as she reached for the reins. On the inside of her wrist, there was a brand. It wasn't a ranch brand. It was a tattoo, crudely done in dark ink. A circle with a serpent eating its own tail, an Ouroboros. And inside the circle, a date, 1875. Jeremiah grabbed her wrist before she could pull away. "What is this?" he demanded. Verity yanked her arm back, her eyes flashing with panic. She pulled her sleeve down frantically, backing away from him until she hit the side of her horse. "That's a prison mark," Jeremiah said, his voice dropping. "Or a cult. Where did you come from, Verity? Who are you really?" She shook her head violently, pleading with her eyes for him to stop asking. She mounted the horse clumsily, kicking it into a trot before he could stop her. Jeremiah watched her ride ahead into the snow-dusted timber. He swung onto Buster, his mind racing. He had won a wife for $500, but as they climbed higher into the thin air, he realized he was bringing a storm into his home that no walls could keep out. And down in the valley, miles behind them, a black carriage was moving along the trail. Inside, Ace Rourke sat opposite a man wearing a long duster and a badge that didn't shine. "You're sure she has the map?" the man in the duster asked. "She has it," Rourke replied, nursing a bruised ego and a glass of whiskey. "She memorized it, and the notebook is with her. We let the mountain man get her through the pass, let him do the hard work. Then we take them both. And the girl? Kill the man." Rourke smiled, a cold, dead thing. "Bring me the girl. She has a lot of talking to do." The High Bighorns, November 1876. The air up here was thin enough to make a lowland man dizzy, but for Jeremiah, it was the only air worth breathing. His cabin sat on a granite shelf overlooking a valley that dropped away into a sea of pine and spruce. It was built of stout lodgepole pine, chinked with moss and mud that had hardened to stone. It was a fortress against the elements, and now a prison for two. Life in the high country settled into a rhythm dictated by survival. Wood had to be chopped. Water had to be hauled from the creek before it froze solid. The horses needed tending. For the first week, Jeremiah watched Verity like he would trapped cougar. He expected her to run. He expected her to steal his gold and vanish down the trail. But she did neither. Verity worked. She didn't just work. She attacked the filth of his bachelorhood with a vengeance. She scrubbed the soot-stained floors until the wood grain showed. She organized his chaotic pantry of dry goods. She took the stiff, blood-stained buckskins he'd thrown in the corner and mended them with neat, tiny stitches. And she cooked. Jeremiah was used to eating burnt biscuits and tough venison. Verity took the same ingredients, flour, lard, salt, deer meat, and turned them into meals that made him groan with satisfaction. She found wild sage and onion beneath the snowline. She made a sourdough starter from scratch. But the silence remained. It was a wall between them, thick and impenetrable. One evening, a week after their arrival, a heavy snow began to fall. Jeremiah sat by the hearth, cleaning his Winchester rifle. Verity was across the room, kneading dough on the rough-hewn table. "You realize winter is here for good now," Jeremiah said, the click-clack of the rifle lever echoing in the room. "Pass gets snowed in about now. No one comes up. No one goes down till spring thaw." Verity didn't pause in her kneading, but her shoulders stiffened. "If you have family looking for you," Jeremiah pressed, watching her reflection in the darkened window, "they won't find you." She turned then, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. She met his gaze. It was a look of defiance, but also of resignation. She walked over to the mantel where he kept a calendar from the Cheyenne leader and pointed to the date, November 12th. Then she pointed to herself and made a cutting motion across her throat. "You're saying you're dead to them?" Jeremiah asked. She nodded. Jeremiah set the rifle down. "Who is Ace Rourke to you? He said you were his ward. But men don't sell their wards for poker chips unless they hate them." Verity's face paled. She rushed back to the table and resumed kneading the dough with a violence that sent puffs of flour into the air. Jeremiah stood up and walked over to her. He towered over her small frame. He reached out and placed his hand over hers on the dough, stopping her movement. "I ain't him," Jeremiah rumbled softly. "I bought you to get you out of that hellhole. You're free, Verity. You understand?" "You ain't a slave here. You're a guest. Until spring." Verity looked up at him. Her green eyes searched his face, looking for the lie. When she didn't find one, her expression softened. For the first time, she reached out and touched his arm. Her hand was warm. The moment was broken by the sound of Buster whinnying in the barn outside. It was a high, panicked sound. Jeremiah spun around, grabbing his Winchester. "Stay here. Bar the door." He threw on his coat and plunged out into the night. The snow was falling in heavy sheets, visibility reduced to a few yards. He made his way to the barn, the lantern swinging in his hand. Inside, the horses were thrashing in their stalls. Jeremiah raised the lantern. The barn door was unlatched, swinging slightly in the wind. He hadn't left it unlatched. He racked around into the chamber. Who's there? Silence, save for the wind. He moved through the shadows, checking every corner. Nothing. But in the fresh snow just outside the door, he found it. A boot print. Not his, not Verity's. A lug-soled boot, city-made. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching them. Jeremiah ran back to the cabin. He pounded on the door. "Verity, open up!" She unbarred the door, her face white with fear. "Douse the lights," Jeremiah ordered, kicking the snow off his boots. "We're being hunted!" He spent the night awake, sitting in the dark with his rifle across his lap, watching the tree line. He realized then that the game Rourke had spoken of wasn't over. Rourke hadn't just lost a hand of poker. He had lost something he desperately wanted back. And Jeremiah Holt, a man who just wanted to be left alone, was now the only thing standing between a terrified woman and a shallow grave. The cabin. 3 weeks later. The siege of winter had truly begun. The snow was 4 feet deep, drifting against the cabin walls. The intruder hadn't returned, but the threat hung over the cabin like the storm clouds above. Tension inside the cabin had shifted. It wasn't fear anymore. It was a strange, domestic intimacy. They moved around each other with a practiced dance. Jeremiah chopped wood. Verity stacked it. He hunted. She dressed the game. But the secret of her voice was gnawing at him. He knew she could speak. He needed to know what she knew. The break came on a Tuesday. Jeremiah was up on the roof, clearing a heavy load of snow that threatened to cave in the beams. It was treacherous work. The shingles were slick with ice. "Watch the edge!" he told himself, digging his boot into the frozen thatch. He didn't see the patch of black ice near the chimney. His foot slipped. His weight shifted too fast. Jeremiah slid. He clawed at the roof, but his gloves found no purchase. He went over the edge, falling 12 feet. He landed hard on the woodpile, his right leg twisting underneath him with a sickening crack that echoed off the valley walls. The world went white, then red with pain. He gasped, the air knocked out of his lungs. He tried to move, but his leg screamed in agony. A compound fracture. He could see the bone pressing against the leather of his pants. "Verity!" he wheezed, the sound weak. The cabin door flew open. Verity rushed out, no shawl, just her dress. She saw him crumpled in the snow and froze for a second, horror washing over her face. "Help me, inside," Jeremiah gritted out, sweat instantly freezing on his forehead. She didn't panic. She ran to him, sliding her small frame under his arm. "Up," she mouthed. It was an agonizing 10 minutes. He was a big man, over 200 pounds of muscle. She was barely 100 wet. But she had a leverage and strength born of desperation. They stumbled into the cabin, and he collapsed onto the bearskin rug before the fire. Jeremiah was drifting in and out of consciousness. The pain was blinding. "Whiskey," he slurred. "In the cupboard." Verity ran to fetch the bottle. She poured some into a cup and held it to his lips. He drank, coughing. "Knife," he whispered. "Cut the pant leg. Need to set it." He watched her through hazy eyes. Her hands were shaking, but she took his Bowie knife and sliced open the heavy buckskin. The sight was grim. The bone had broken the skin. Blood was pooling on the rug. Jeremiah groaned. I got to set it. Tie a belt. Bite down." He tried to reach for his leg, but his hands were too weak. The shock was setting in. Verity looked at the leg, then at him. She took a deep breath. She stood up, walked to the stove, and grabbed a clean linen towel. She threw it into a pot of boiling water. Then she washed her hands in a basin, scrubbing them raw with lye soap. She came back and knelt beside him. She placed her hands on his leg. They were steady now. "Don't," Jeremiah mumbled. "You don't know." "Shut up, Jeremiah," she said. The voice was clear, melodic, and commanding. It was the voice of an educated woman, refined and sharp as glass. Jeremiah was too shocked to respond. He just stared at her. "This is going to hurt more than anything you've ever felt," she said, her green eyes locking onto his. "But if I don't set this bone perfectly, you'll lose the leg. Do you understand?" He nodded, dumbfounded. "Bite this," she said, shoving a piece of leather strap between his teeth. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed his ankle with one hand and the calf with the other. She used her body weight, leaning back to apply traction. Jeremiah screamed into the leather, a primal sound that was muffled by the gag. With a sickening crunch, the bone snapped back into place. Jeremiah blacked out. When he woke, the fire was roaring. He was in his bed, elevated on pillows. His leg was splinted with straight pieces of kindling and wrapped tightly in clean white linen. The smell of willow bark tea filled the room. Verity was sitting in the rocking chair by the fire, reading the leather-bound notebook. Jeremiah cleared his throat. It felt like he had swallowed sand. Verity looked up. She didn't look away this time. She closed the book. "You speak," Jeremiah rasped. "I do," she said. She poured a cup of the tea and brought it to him. "Drink this. It helps with the fever and pain." He took the cup. "Who are you?" She sat on the edge of the bed. The pretense was gone. The simpleton from the gem saloon had vanished, replaced by a woman of steel and secrets. "My name is Verity Miller," she said. "My father was Judge Thaddeus Miller of the Territorial Circuit Court." Jeremiah's eyes widened. "Judge Miller? He was killed in a stagecoach robbery outside Cheyenne 6 months ago." "It wasn't a robbery," Verity said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It was an execution." She reached for the notebook and held it up. "My father was investigating a land ring. A group of powerful men, railroad tycoons, politicians, and a man named Barrett who runs the shadowy Iroboro Syndicate. They are stealing land claims from miners and settlers, changing the deeds, and funneling the gold into a slush fund to buy the upcoming statehood vote." She tapped the cover of the book. "This contains the ledger. Names. Dates. Bribes. My father gave it to me right before the coach was stopped. He told me to run." Jeremiah stared at the book. "And Rourke?" "Rourke is a fixer for the syndicate. He found me in Denver. I played the mute simpleton to keep him from killing me. If he knew I had the book, or that I could read it, I would be dead. He thought I was just a witness he could sell off once he got bored of me." She looked at Jeremiah, her eyes filling with tears. "I didn't mean to drag you into this, Jeremiah. But when you put that gold on the table, you were the first man in 6 months who looked at me like a human being, not a commodity." Jeremiah looked at his splinted leg, then at the woman who had saved him. "You know they're coming," Jeremiah said. "That footprint in the barn, it was a scout." "I know," Verity said. "Rourke will bring help. They can't let this book survive the winter." Jeremiah reached out and took her hand. "Then we prepare. I can't walk, but I can shoot. And you," he squeezed her hand, "you're a hell of a doctor, Mrs. Holt." Verity smiled, a genuine, dazzling smile that lit up the dark cabin. "I learned from my uncle. He was a surgeon in the Union Army." "Good," Jeremiah said, his face hardening. "Because before this winter is out, we're going to need to do a lot more than set bones. We're going to war." The cabin, December 1876. The first shot didn't sound like a gunshot. It sounded like a branch snapping under the weight of the snow, a sharp crack that echoed through the valley. But then the window above the wash basin shattered, spraying glass across the floorboards. "Down!" Jeremiah roared, rolling off the bed and hitting the floor, ignoring the scream of agony from his splinted leg. Verity was already moving. She dove behind the heavy oak table just as a second bullet thudded into the wood, sending splinters flying into her hair. "They're here," she whispered, her face pale but her eyes fierce. Jeremiah dragged himself toward his Winchester, which was propped against the wall. "How many?" he gritted out, levering around into the chamber. Verity crawled to the edge of the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. "I see 4. No, 5. They're in the tree line. They have rifles," Jeremiah cursed. He was a sitting duck, a cripple in a wooden box. He looked at Verity. She wasn't a soldier. She was a judge's daughter. But right now, she was his only flank. "Verity," he said, his voice steadying. "Grab the scattergun. The double barrel." She hesitated, looking at the heavy shotgun hanging over the mantel. "Do it!" She scrambled across the floor, staying low. She grabbed the weapon. It was almost as big as she was. "Load it," Jeremiah instructed. "Buckshot. If that door opens, you don't aim. You just point it at the belly and pull both triggers. You understand?" "I understand," she said. Her hands shook as she jammed the shells into the breech, but she snapped it shut with a satisfying clack. Outside, a voice echoed. It was Rourke. "Holt, you hear me in there? We don't want you. Send the girl out with the book, and we'll ride away. You have my word as a gentleman." Jeremiah laughed, a dry, dark sound. He dragged himself to a nuth hole in the logs he used for ventilation. He lined up his sights. He could see a shape moving behind a ponderosa pine, a man in a long yellow duster. "Your word ain't worth the spit to shine my boots. Rourke!" Jeremiah shouted back. He squeezed the trigger. The Winchester barked. The man in the yellow duster spun around, clutching his shoulder, and fell into the snow. "That's my answer!" Jeremiah yelled. The response was a hail of lead. Bullets tore through the thin chinking between the logs. Pans fell from the shelves. The lantern on the table shattered. The cabin became a chaotic hell of flying wood and dust. "Keep your head down," Jeremiah yelled over the noise. For an hour, it was a stalemate. The attackers couldn't get close without crossing the open snow, and Jeremiah, even crippled, was the best shot in the territory. Every time a head popped up, a bullet from the cabin pinned them back. But Jeremiah was running low on ammo. "Verity," he called out, "I'm down to 6 rounds." Verity looked around the room. Her eyes landed on the crate of mining supplies Jeremiah kept in the corner, leftovers from his prospecting days. "Jeremiah," she said, crawling toward him. "The blasting powder." Jeremiah looked at the crate. "It's unstable, and we can't throw it that far." "We don't have to throw it," she said. She grabbed a small tin of black powder and a roll of fuse. The stovepipe. Jeremiah realized what she was thinking. The stovepipe went straight up through the roof. If they could get an explosive charge onto the roof, the blast might drop enough snow to create a screen. Or better yet, trigger a slide on the slope above the tree line. "It's suicide," Jeremiah said. "It's that or they burn us out," she countered. She was already fusing the tin. "Cover me," she yelled. Before Jeremiah could stop her, Verity stood up. She grabbed the tin and ran to the fireplace. She shoved the tin up the chimney flue, lit the fuse, and then threw a heavy iron skillet up to wedge it in place. "Run!" she screamed, diving back toward Jeremiah. She threw herself over him, shielding his body with hers. Boom! The explosion wasn't huge, but it was contained. The chimney blew outward at the top. The concussion shook the cabin to its foundation. Soot and debris rained down. But outside, the effect was catastrophic for Rourke's men. The blast had dislodged a massive cornice of ice and snow from the overhang above the cabin. It didn't hit the cabin. It crashed down onto the slope where the gunmen were hiding. A roar filled the valley as tons of white powder swept through the trees. Silence followed. Jeremiah pushed the debris off them. "You crazy, wonderful woman." Verity was coughing, her face black with soot. She grinned. "Did it work?" Jeremiah pulled himself up to the window. The tree line was buried. 2 horses were running loose. There was no sign of the men. "I think you bought us some time," Jeremiah said. He looked at her, really looked at her. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by something warmer. "Verity, if we get out of this—" "Don't," she whispered, putting a finger to his lips. "Don't say if, say when." He kissed her hand. "When?" But the victory was short-lived. A single gunshot rang out from a distant ridge, too far for the slide to have reached. The bullet didn't hit them. It hit the oil lamp hanging from the ceiling beam. The oil spilled onto the dry bearskin rug. The fire spread instantly. "Out!" Jeremiah yelled. "We have to move! Now!" They had survived the siege, but they had lost their fortress, the trail to Spearfish. 2 days later, they were refugees in the wilderness. The cabin was a smoldering ruin behind them, a black scar on the white mountain. Jeremiah leaned heavily on Verity. He had fashioned a crutch from a burnt sapling, but every step was a battle against pain. They had managed to salvage the horses, Buster and the mare, before the barn caught fire, but they had limited supplies. 2 blankets, a bag of jerky, the Winchester with 3 rounds left, and the leather-bound book. They were descending toward the mining road that led to Spearfish. Jeremiah knew they needed a doctor, and they needed law. Just a few more miles. Jeremiah rasped, his face gray with exhaustion. "There's a way station near the crossroads." Verity rode the mare, leading Buster, who carried Jeremiah. She was constantly scanning the woods. Rourke was still out there. He hadn't been in the tree line during the slide. He was too smart for that. As they rounded a bend, they saw a rider approaching from the valley below. Jeremiah instantly leveled his rifle. "Hold fire!" the rider shouted, raising his hands. He wore a tin star on his chest that caught the winter sun. Jeremiah squinted. "Marshall?" The man rode closer. He was handsome in a rugged way, with a thick mustache and eyes that seemed to smile. "Jeremiah Holt? Is that you?" Jeremiah lowered the rifle, relief flooding his body. "Samuel? Samuel Cobb?" "The very same," the marshal said, tipping his hat. He looked at Verity, then at Jeremiah's leg. "Looks like you folks have been through hell. You have no idea," Jeremiah said. "Samuel, this is Verity. We're being hunted. Ace Rourke in the Ouroboros ring." Marshal Cobb's expression darkened. "I know. That's why I'm here. I've been tracking Rourke for weeks. I found 3 of his men buried in a snowslide up the ridge. Figured he might have gone after you." Cobb dismounted and offered a canteen. "Drink. I have a camp set up a mile down. Warm fire, hot coffee." "Let's get you off that horse." Verity watched the marshal carefully. She didn't speak. She clutched the saddlebag where the book was hidden. They rode to Cobb's camp. It was neat, orderly, with a roaring fire. Cobb helped Jeremiah down and settled him on a bedroll. He was gentle, solicitous, checking the splint with professional care. "You're lucky, Jeremiah," Cobb said, pouring coffee. "Another day out here and gangrene would have taken this leg." "We need to get to the federal garrison," Jeremiah said. "Verity has evidence, a ledger. It proves everything. The land theft, the murders, Judge Miller." Cobb froze for a fraction of a second while pouring the coffee. He didn't look up. "A ledger, you say?" "It names everyone," Jeremiah continued, trusting his old friend implicitly. "Every corrupt official in the territory. Is that so?" Cobb stood up and walked over to Verity. He smiled, a charming, disarming smile. "That's a dangerous thing to carry, Miss Miller. Perhaps I should take it into evidence. Keep it safe." Verity stared at him. Something was wrong. His boots. They were high quality, polished leather. Not the boots of a man who had been tracking outlaws in the snow for weeks. And his horse. It wasn't winded. It was fresh. She casually moved her hand toward the saddlebag, slipping the book out and tucking it under her shawl. She opened it slightly, pretending to adjust her dress. She remembered the index. C. She glanced down. Samuel Cobb, U.S. Marshal, $5,000 payment, August 1876. Her blood turned to ice. "Jeremiah," she said, her voice trembling. "What is it?" Jeremiah asked, sipping the coffee. "The book," she said, backing away. It mentions a payment." Cobb stopped smiling. His hand drifted toward his holster. "Verity?" Jeremiah asked, confused. "What are you saying?" "Page 42, Verity said, her eyes locked on Cobb. "August payment, $5,000 to Marshal Samuel Cobb for services rendered in the Miller case. Silence descended on the camp. The crackling fire sounded like gunshots. Jeremiah looked at his old friend. Samuel? Cobb sighed. It was a sound of disappointment, not guilt. You always were too trusting, Jeremiah. That's why you live on a mountain. You don't understand how the world works down here. You killed her father? Jeremiah asked, his voice low and dangerous. Thaddeus Miller was a dinosaur, Cobb spat. He stood in the way of progress. The railroad is coming, Jeremiah. Statehood is coming. Men like Barrett, they're building the future. I just ensured the road was paved. Cobb drew his revolver. Give me the book, Verity. No, Jeremiah roared. He tried to lunge for his Winchester, but his leg gave way. He collapsed, reaching for the rifle. Bang. Cobb fired. The bullet didn't hit Jeremiah's heart. It struck his shoulder, spinning him around and pinning him to the ground. Jeremiah! Verity screamed. She turned to run, but Cobb was fast. He grabbed her by the hair, yanking her back. She clawed at his face, but he backhanded her, sending her sprawling into the snow. He stood over her, the smoking gun pointed at her chest. The book. Now. Verity pulled the ledger from her shawl. She looked at Jeremiah, who was gasping for air, blood pooling under his shoulder. He was trying to crawl toward her, his eyes filled with helpless rage. Here, she sobbed, holding the book out. Cobb snatched it. He flipped through the pages, nodding. This is it. Rourke was incompetent. Always said so. He tucked the book into his coat. He looked at Verity, then at Jeremiah. I can't leave witnesses, Cobb said. He cocked the hammer. Wait, Verity screamed. Don't kill him. Please. I'll go with you. I'll do whatever you say. I'll say Rourke did it. Just let him live. Cobb considered this. He looked at the bleeding mountain man. Jeremiah was fading fast. The shoulder wound was bad, and the leg was broken. The cold would finish him before nightfall. He's dead anyway, Cobb sneered. Nature will do the work for me. Saves a bullet. He grabbed Verity by the arm and hauled her toward his horse. You're coming with me, darling. We have a meeting with Mr. Barrett in Deadwood. He'll want to meet the woman who caused us so much trouble. Jeremiah! Verity cried out as Cobb threw her onto his horse and mounted behind her. Jeremiah lay in the snow, his vision blurring. He watched as his friend, the man he had trusted, rode away with the woman he loved. Verity, he whispered. The darkness closed in. The fire Cobb had built crackled nearby, mocking him with its warmth. Jeremiah Holt was alone again, broken, bleeding, and defeated. But as his eyes closed, his hand tightened around something in the snow. It wasn't his rifle. It was the tin cup Verity had drunk from. The scent of her, sage and resilience, lingered on it. He didn't die. He wouldn't die. Not while she was with them. The mountain man took a breath. Then another. And the rage in his heart burned hotter than the fire. Deadwood, Dakota Territory. Christmas Eve, 1876. Pain was a color. It was white, blinding, and pure. Jeremiah didn't know how long he had lain in the snow. Minutes? Hours? The fire Cobb had built was dead ash. The cold was gnawing at his extremities, turning his fingers into stiff claws. He should be dead. He wanted to be dead. It would be easier than the agony pulsing from the bullet hole in his shoulder and the shattered bone in his leg. But then, a warm, wet breath blew against his face. Buster. The massive roan stallion nudged him, nickering softly. The horse hadn't run. He had stayed, guarding his rider against the wolves that were already howling in the lower canyon. Jeremiah groaned, his eyes fluttering open. He saw the gray sky. He saw the horse. And then he saw the empty space where Verity had been. Verity. The name sparked a fire in his gut that the snow couldn't extinguish. He remembered her scream. He remembered Cobb's betrayal. Not yet, Jeremiah whispered, his voice a broken rasp. He grabbed the stirrup leather hanging above him. With a scream that tore through the silent woods, he hauled himself up. His vision swam. He vomited bile into the snow. He needed to stop the bleeding. He reached into his saddlebag with trembling fingers and found a spare cartridge. He bit the bullet off, pouring the black powder into the open wound on his shoulder. He struck a match. He didn't hesitate. He touched the flame to the powder. Flash. Sizzle. Jeremiah didn't scream this time. The pain was so absolute, it silenced him. He slumped against the horse, gasping, sweat freezing instantly on his skin. The wound was cauterized. He couldn't walk. He definitely couldn't fight. But he wasn't a man anymore. He was a force of nature, carved from the granite of the bighorns. He used his belt to strap his broken leg tight to the saddle fender. He hauled himself onto Buster's back, blacking out for a second before the cold air slapped him awake. "Deadwood," he commanded the horse. Buster knew the way. The Grand Central Hotel, Deadwood. The dining room of the Grand Central Hotel was a stark contrast to the wilderness. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over tables laden with roasted goose, champagne, and oysters shipped in on ice from the coast. At the head table sat Hiram Barrett, the railroad tycoon. He was a corpulent man with eyes like shiny black beads. Beside him sat Marshal Samuel Cobb, looking fresh and heroic, accepting toasts from the local politicians. And between them sat Verity. She was dressed in fine silk, a grotesque parody of the rescue Cobb claimed to have performed. Her hands were not bound, but the bruise on her cheek was poorly hidden by powder. Barrett's hand rested possessively on the back of her chair. To Marshal Cobb, Barrett raised his glass. For ridding the territory of the madman Jeremiah Holt and saving this poor, mute creature from his clutches, the room applauded. Verity gripped the silverware until her knuckles turned white. She wanted to scream the truth, but Cobb had whispered to her earlier, "One word, and I burn the ledger. Then I burn you." The ledger sat in the center of the table, a trophy. "A shame about the mountain man," a banker noted. "I heard he was a tough customer. A savage," Cobb said smoothly, sipping his wine. "He fought like an animal. I had no choice but to put him down." Verity stared at the door. "He's not dead," she told herself. "He can't be." Suddenly, the laughter in the room faltered. The heavy double doors of the dining hall swung open. A gust of freezing wind blew in, extinguishing the candles near the entrance. Snow swirled across the polished floorboards. A figure stood in the doorway. He looked like a revenant risen from the grave. His buffalo coat was shredded and stained with dried blood. His face was a mask of soot and frost. One leg dragged behind him, stiff and unnatural. But in his hand, the Colt peacemaker looked steady as a rock. "Cobb!" The name was a growl, low and vibrating with menace. Marshal Cobb dropped his wine glass. It shattered, red wine spreading like blood on the white tablecloth. "Holt?" Cobb stammered, his face draining of color. I killed you." Jeremiah limped forward, step by agonizing step. The guests scrambled away, overturning chairs, screaming. "You tried," Jeremiah said, "but the mountain didn't want me." Barrett stood up, trembling. "Marshal, do your duty! Shoot this madman!" Cobb fumbled for his gun, his hands shaking. He was a bully, a killer of unsuspecting men. But looking into Jeremiah's eyes that had seen the other side of death, he felt a primal terror. Jeremiah didn't raise his gun. He kept walking. "You took my wife, Samuel. She's not your wife," Cobb yelled, finally clearing leather. "She's a witness! She's property!" "She," Jeremiah said, stopping 10 paces away, "is the only good thing in this God-forsaken world. And you hurt her." Cobb fired. The bullet struck Jeremiah in the chest. Jeremiah flinched, but he didn't fall. The heavy buffalo coat, layered with thick muscle and pure will, absorbed the impact. Or perhaps he simply refused to die. Verity seized the moment. She grabbed the steak knife from her plate and plunged it into Barrett's hand as he reached for his derringer. Barrett screamed. Verity grabbed the ledger and dove under the table. "Kill him!" Barrett shrieked. Cobb cocked his revolver for a second shot, but Jeremiah was done walking. "Draw," Jeremiah whispered. His hand moved. It was a blur, faster than thought, faster than pain. Bang, bang, bang. 3 shots. The first hit Cobb in the right shoulder, shattering his gun arm. The marshal dropped his weapon, screaming. The second hit him in the knee, dropping him to the floor. The third shot knocked the tin star off his chest, sending it spinning across the room. Jeremiah stood over him. The room was deathly silent. "You don't deserve a quick death," Jeremiah said, looking down at the whimpering man. "But I'm done with killing." He looked at the crowd. "Get the sheriff. The real one." Verity crawled out from under the table. She ran to Jeremiah. He swayed, his strength finally failing him. She caught him before he hit the floor. "Jeremiah!" she cried, pressing her hands against his chest. "You came back!" Jeremiah looked at her, his vision tunneling. He managed a weak, crooked smile. "I had a royal flush, remember? I don't fold on a winning hand." Then, the mountain man closed his eyes. Spearfish Valley, May 1877. The trial of Hiram Barrett and Samuel Cobb was the sensation of the decade. The Miller Ledger, presented by Verity Miller, exposed a corruption ring that went all the way to Washington. Barrett was ruined and imprisoned. Cobb was hanged for the murder of Judge Miller. But far away from the gavels and the gallows, up in a high meadow where the wildflowers were just pushing through the soil, a new cabin was being built. Jeremiah Holt sat on a stump, watching the work. He walked with a cane now, his legs stiff on cold mornings, but he walked. Verity was in the garden, planting seeds. She wore a simple calico dress, the same one she had worn in the saloon, now mended and clean. She stood up, wiping dirt from her hands, and looked at him. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. "Mail rider came by," she said, walking over to him. He brought the deed. She handed him a paper. It was the land grant for 600 acres of prime timber and grazing land, signed by the governor himself, a reward for their service to the territory. Jeremiah looked at the paper, then at her. "Says here the owners are Mr. and Mrs. Jeremiah Holt." Verity smiled, that same dazzling smile that had saved his life in the dark of winter. "Well, we never did make it official, did we? The poker game doesn't count in the eyes of the church." Jeremiah pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "We can ride to the mission tomorrow. Make it right. No need to rush," Verity whispered, leaning her head on his shoulder as they looked out over the valley they had conquered. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm exactly where I belong." The mountain man and the judge's daughter stood together, watching the sun set over the bighorns. They had survived the cold, the bullets, and the betrayal. They had gambled everything on each other, and in the end, they had won the only pot that mattered. And that, my friends, is the legend of Jeremiah and Verity Holt, a story that reminds us that sometimes the most valuable things in life aren't found in a gold mine, but in the heart of a stranger who refuses to give up on you. It makes you wonder, if you were sitting at that table in the Gem Saloon, holding a royal flush, would you have played it for money, or would you have bet it all on a human life? If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. It helps us tell more stories like this one. Don't forget to share this with someone who loves a good Western romance, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a saga. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next trail.